Welcome back to Proxammer, everybody. And today we're going to be talking about the classic Eldar runes of fate. These are the runes and the psychic powers that we all know and love from the Eldar that are classics that have gone back from pretty much the beginning of Eldar. The question is, we have 6 powers on this runes of fate table, but which ones are the best? Which ones are we going to be using most? And what are the pros and cons of each one? So let's get into it. So we have 6 powers to choose from. 2 are offensive psychic powers, and 4 of them are buffs, and there's 1 debuff in there. Now, all of these psychic powers have a bonus when you roll high on the test. When you roll, I think, a 10 plus, or in some cases, a little bit less than that, you can get bonuses to the powers. So this is usually an extra 6 inches of range, but can also be a bonus effect. For example, one of the powers, Mind War, has an extra effect when you roll over a certain amount, over a 10, I believe. And we'll go into that when we talk about Mind War. But the thing about these buffs and debuffs is they only work on core units. So vehicles and Wraith Knights, and even certain, like walkers or warlock units can't benefit from it, unfortunately. So the first psychic power we have here is Guide. Now this is the classic Eldar psychic power, but they actually buffed it this edition. So basically what it does now is it lasts 1 full round, and it can be used to reroll all hits. And that means shooting and combat for an entire round. So that means in your own turn, you can shoot, assault, reroll all your hits. In the enemy turn, you can also reroll all your hits as well. During the enemy combat phase, if your unit is still in combat. So this is a really useful ability. It's absolutely great. I personally think it's an auto take for almost every Eldar army out there. Guide is just so useful in so many ways. There's a lot of Eldar abilities also that proc on 6s a hit, so this helps with that too. And if you roll a 10 or more, you get an extra 6 inches on it. Not necessarily needed, but, a little bonus if you need it. And just really can't get in range for whatever reason, that psychic phase. You could use Strands of Fate and hope for a good roll on that other roll, a 4+ to get within range. So it's not something that's always going to happen, but it's a little bit helpful in some cases. However, it can only target core units. So that means, no more targeting War Walkers, unfortunately. No targeting Wraith Knights, things like that. But works for every other core unit in the book. And the other thing about Guide is it's really easy to get off. It goes off on basically a warp charge of 6, so you just need to roll a 6 or above. Really easy to get off. Because it's a blessing, you can use it away from the enemy unit, so you can position yourself to be outside of their denial range. So it's just a really reliable power overall, and I think probably the best Eldar psychic power that we actually have access to. And next up is a psychic power. It's a Witchfire psychic power, Executioner. So Executioner is a little bit more of a warp charge 7. And basically what it does is you can select a unit, except it can't select characters with wounds of less than 9, within 18 inches, and that enemy unit suffers D3 mortal wounds. Then, if a model is destroyed, it suffers another D3 mortal wounds. So essentially what this boils down to, this is just a more specialized version of Smite. It's less effective on big stuff and characters. It's more effective versus infantry. So it's actually really effective against highly armored or invuled heavy infantry with 1 wound. So it's a very specialized psychic power. And to be honest with you, because it's so specialized, unless you are running something very specific with your Farseer, and you want to be running them in a way that's dealing a lot of mortal wounds to enemy targets, unless you're running that kind of build, I wouldn't recommend using Executioner just because it doesn't really have the power behind it to do anything more than just cause a few mortal wounds a turn. If you're lucky and you roll everything correct, on average, you'll probably get about 4 mortal wounds a turn with it. So it's decent. It's not really the best psychic power. And honestly, in some cases, it's overshadowed by smite, especially with Strands of Fate. You can get a smite to be, D6 mortal wounds on anything, regardless of whether or not that first D3 destroys a model or not. So remember, the first part of this rule is it's just D3. You have to actually destroy an enemy model to get an additional D3 with it. So, average rolls say that on an infantry unit, even an infantry unit with 2 wounds, you'll at least get to roll that additional D3, but the problem is that sometimes you really don't know, and you could easily roll that 1 and everything ends right there. So overall, I think it's kind of a gimmicky psychic power. I think unless you're specifically running, like I said before, a Farseer that's only goal is to cause mortal wounds, I think you have to leave this one at home. I think you have to leave this one in the book because it's just not going to provide that much value for you over the course of the game. All right, so then we have Mind War. Then we come to the Great Mind War. So if you are like me and you've been playing for years and years and years, you will remember Mind War is probably the most ragey psychic power in the game. Because it used to be able to target things like heavy weapons out of squads, special weapons, sergeants. And let me tell you, the amount of times I got people to question this ability's rules and so forth was pretty much insane. This used to be a really ragey psychic power. However, it is no longer what it used to be. It is no longer the rage-filled psychic power of the enemy's nightmares. Now what it does is basically you choose a character. So that means you can't choose special weapons, heavy weapons, and units and stuff like that. You roll a dice. Each of you rolls a dice, and the enemy add it to your leadership, and the enemy suffers mortal wounds from the difference between those totals. So many of you that maybe be newer players will look at this ability and say, oh my God, wow, this is great. If I roll a 6 and they roll low, I can kill a character pretty much instantly. And this can happen, right? The enemy can roll a 1 and you can roll a 6. And if they have slightly lower leadership than you, maybe leadership 8, yes, you can kill a character in a single blast, single psychic power. But the problem is that the only way that this power is useful is if you get really lucky and roll a 6, and they get really unlucky and roll a 1. Anything outside of that really doesn't really do a lot. Yeah, you can cause a couple mortal wounds on average to an enemy character who has lower leadership than you, but if the enemy has the same leadership, you're basically at a stalemate. And what I mean by this is, yes, of course, sometimes you'll roll higher than them, but also sometimes you may roll lower. So in all, it's very gimmicky. And I believe that when you're choosing psychic powers, you should choose things that are reliable. Remember, Eldar are all about planning and strategy. If you can't realistically plan out the demise of a unit and how you're going to kill that unit or character or whatever it is, then you're taking a huge risk with a model that is honestly very squishy. This only has a range of 18 inches. Now, the interesting thing about this psychic power is that if the result of the test was 10 or more, you can actually roll 2d3 instead of d6. So this gives you slightly better chances of doing mortal wounds to a character, but again, it's still a gimmick, right? You could still roll low. It gives you better chances, but the chances still aren't that great. And to be honest with you, on average rolls, you're going to roll the same as him. If you're both rolling average, then you really don't have a lot of room to do a lot of damage. So really what it boils down to is it boils down to this. Mind War is good in the extremes. Mind War is really good when your opponent's rolling really bad and you are rolling really good. But the same could be said of any unit in the game. So honestly, Mind War is something that used to be a terror. I just don't find it that useful anymore, especially how it's written now. It just doesn't put up the value that it has to be effective. So the next psychic power we have here is Fortune. Now, Fortune is, again, one of those old classic Eldar psychic powers. But instead of re-rolling saves like it used to allow you to do, it doesn't allow you to do that anymore. What it does now is it basically gives you a chance, after all of your saves have been made, after all of that stuff, for each wound lost, you can roll a dice. On a 5+, that wound is not lost. So this is what this means. This means that no matter what kind of abilities the opponent has, as far as ignoring invul saves and ignoring armor, that unit is guaranteed to get a 5+ save against every wound caused. Now, this is every wound caused. So what that means is if you put this on a Wraith Lord, for example, which, I mean, I don't always recommend you putting it on a Wraith Lord, but let's just say for the sake of argument, you put it on a Wraith Lord or a Wraith unit in general with multiple wounds. And the enemy fires a missile launcher at you, and he does 4 wounds. Well, for each of those wounds that he caused, you get to roll a dice, and on a 5+, you can ignore it. This is much better than just ignoring the damage altogether, because rolling a 5+ is kind of difficult. So basically what this means is that for multiple wound units like Wraithguard and stuff like that, you can roll a dice for each single wound lost, and basically that will increase the survivability of the unit much more. So again, somebody fires a missile launcher at your Wraithguard unit or your Wraith Blades, you fail your armor save, you fail your invul save, and that Wraithguard would normally die. That Wraithguard would normally take 3 wounds and die. Well, for each of those wounds, you can roll a dice, and guess what? Only one of those needs to actually be successful for that Wraithguard to still be alive. So Fortune is a great ability, but here's the thing about it. It is a low warp charge, but it's really most effective on Wraith units with multiple wounds. Units with single wounds, I mean, to be honest with you, a lot of our units are very fragile, and they are able to survive through different means. So a lot of our Aspect Warriors just won't really benefit from Fortune that much. There's better powers for them, so they're more offensive, a lot of our Dire Avengers. A lot of our Aspect Warriors. Units like Dire Avengers, Howling Banshees, Striking Scorpions, Shining Spears, all of those units really want to be on the full offense, which means they want to be getting buffs to help them kill enemy units. They don't really care too much about surviving because their goal is to destroy whatever threats are facing them first before they get attacked. But Wraithguard are slow and they need something to help them survive to get into combat. So Fortune's perfect for Wraith units. It's not really as effective for units like Aspect Warrior. Having said that, I still really think it's effective in certain lists, but on most Farseers, you're only going to be able to take 2 psychic powers. So if you're only running 1 Farseer in your list, chances are you're not going to bring Fortune. But if you're running 2 Farseers, chances are you'll probably want to at least bring Fortune with you along, because it does increase the survivability of your army much more if you're able to cast it every turn, and really make Wraith units very hard to kill. And then we have the Will of Azurian. So the Will of Azurian is one of those interesting psychic powers that you look at it and at first it looks terrible, right? You look at it and it gives objective secured, immune to morale checks, and if that unit's performing an action, it can still make attacks with ranged weapons without that action failing. So this is a decent psychic power overall, but newer players might actually look at this psychic power and think, oh, wow, this thing doesn't do any damage. It doesn't do any, it doesn't really help me a whole lot. All it does is make the unit immune to morale checks. And well, I could just use a command point to make them fearless. And that's true. You can. There is a, stratagem for that in the rule book. But to be honest with you, this psychic power is a little bit underrated, I think. I think actually it's very effective in certain circumstances. And the thing is, having the objective secured ability on any core unit or character can be very clutch in games, especially in the late game. If this unit survives to the late game and you have like a Wraith Lord or something like that on an objective and they have 5 Assault Marines, well, guess what? In most cases, you're out of luck. Those Assault Marines are going to take that objective. But if you have this ability, you can throw that on your unit and you can actually benefit from it and get objective secured yourself and take that objective, even though you have less models. So it is a very clutch psychic power. The thing I'll say about Will of Azurian, though, and I think this is its real downfall, is that when compared to other psychic powers, it just doesn't hold up. A lot of Eldar players will look at that and say, well, this ability, this psychic power, I might only really need once or twice a game. I'm not going to need it every turn. But Guide and Doom, or Fortune, I'm going to be using that every single turn. I'm going to get value out of that every single step and every single stage of the game, which is absolutely true. And that's why I think, to be honest, even though Will of Azurian is a good psychic power, compared to the other psychic powers that we get, it's a little bit overshadowed. Objective secured is really good. Auto passing morale test is really good, but there's ways in doing that there's ways to get those things without having to, purchase another Farseer and withhold Guide and Doom. So not being able to choose Guide and Doom. So it's a little bit of a hard choice, but I think in general it just gets overshadowed. And that's the biggest weakness of this psychic power, is that there's better psychic powers on the list. So I still like it, though. I still think it can be clutch, and especially with lists that run multiple Farseers. Honestly, I wouldn't be opposed to using this in a lot of them. I know it sounds crazy, but I think if a list was running like 3 or 2 Farseers, this could easily make it on the list. And last, but certainly not least, probably one of the most popular psychic powers in the Eldar Codex is Doom. Now, basically what this does is you target an enemy unit, and all attacks that are made by an Eldar Core or Craftworld character unit can be re-rolled, their wound roll. So this is really effective for 2 big reasons. One reason is it helps you get more wounds on targets and makes targets easier to kill. But it also helps you proc special Eldar abilities that only work on unmodified 6s to wound. So things like Mandablasters, Shuriken weapons, certain relics that require 6s to wound to get, mortal wounds. It's usually mortal wounds or extra AP or something like that. This will help you proc those extra effects much more often and will increase the value of that unit a lot more. And this will turn units that may not seem like they are able to kill big targets into huge target killers. For example, Dire Avengers. If you put Doom on something like a Dread Knight, and you shoot it with a full unit of Dire Avengers, kitted out, Blade Storm, and Shredding Fire and all that, you're probably going to end up killing that Wraith Knight just because of the fact that you get so many rerolls and you're getting so many high AP damage shots in against it, even though they're only damage 1. So basically, Doom can take a unit that's not supposed to be good against a certain target and make them great against that target. And whenever a psychic power can do this, it's absolutely worth its weight in gold and whatever points you have to spend on it. And to give you guys a little bit of a throwback, I did a video on Dire Avengers a while back, probably 3-4 weeks ago now, basically saying that they were overpowered if you built them a certain way. And honestly, with Doom, they become monster and vehicle killers. I know that seems insane to some of you, and you may think, of course they can't do that. But with the Shuriken special rule and the different abilities they have, they absolutely can shred things like Dread Knights, no problem. So, think about it. Doom, probably one of the best Eldar psychic powers. I think Guide is probably the most useful because you're going to be casting it every single turn with no problems. But Doom is absolutely second in terms of competitiveness and effectiveness as well. And you would be hard pressed to find an Eldar list that doesn't run Doom and Guide in it. And to be honest with you guys, especially when it comes to Doom, it may be a little hard to get off sometimes. And I think that's the only real weakness of Doom, is that you have to get within 18 inches of the enemy, and they will probably, if they're a good player, if they have a Psyker, they'll probably position something within 24 to deny it. And when that happens with any of your psychic powers, you're just going to have to, think about that ahead of time and plan your Strands of Fate rolls accordingly so that you don't get denied as often. Okay, so in conclusion, what are the best psychic powers on the list, right? That's what you guys all want to know. Well, obviously, again, I don't have to be an expert Eldar player or 40k player to tell you, Guide and Doom are by and above the best powers on the list. And the reason being is they're going to be useful in every single game and in every single scenario. So when you have psychic powers like that, they're useful in every case that you come across. Of course, you're going to see them in every list. And that's why you see competitive players running Farseers with Guide and Doom and nothing else, because Guide and Doom are going to be useful in every single situation. Every single enemy, Guide and Doom are effective against. Every opponent, every list, every strategy, they're effective. And they're very effective at that. And I'm not saying there's not other useful ways to run Farseers. Obviously, there are some builds I think could be unique, like I was contemplating the other day a kind of more of a Witchfire build with a Farseer. But honestly, Guided Doom, probably in general the most useful. Fortune is also great, but Fortune has the downfall of only really being effective with when cast on multi-wound models and units like Wraiths, to just make them even tougher than they already are, make them very great at holding objectives and holding down enemy units. Our Aspect Warriors really can't benefit much from it because either they're going to be out of line of sight or they're going to be busy killing their intended targets so they don't suffer retaliation. And I think Will of Azurian is an interesting power, but it's very, very circumstantial. And usually most of the time, you're not going to be casting it every turn because it's really just not needed. Now, on the other hand, the Witchfire powers, they're okay. They're okay. They're not super overpowered, obviously, thankfully, because at one point, Witchfire powers were kind of OP. But they're not overpowered. It's just that usually, games don't warrant taking them. There's a lot of things people can do against Witchfire powers. Even if they do mortal wounds, there's a lot of ways to deny them and get around them. And in general, they just don't provide the value that the other psychic powers provide. So most of the time, you're not going to see people taking the Witchfire powers. All right, everybody. That's it for this video. I hope you guys learned something. And stay tuned. I have more videos coming. I have a video on Wraithguard and stratagems coming up. So stay tuned for that. I will see you guys next time. Have a great rest of your day. And as always, thanks for watching. Peace out.